Finn and I are going to do a bit of a double header. I'm going to speak about some stuff which is probably kind of more our view or our experience of working within sort of project management structures, broadly speaking, within infrastructure largely. And then Finn's going to take over and talk about some of the things that we sort of see being questions or opportunities maybe for the future. So if this works properly. Great. So just a little bit about us. A lot of you will have worked with us in the past or have experience of what we do and that sort of thing. But just to sort of put it in context, we were thinking about this the other day, and you can either read this with a Jeremy Clarkson voice or think about it like the Carlsberg advert, in that we reckon we're probably the largest independent specialist archaeological geophysics contractor in the world, which is a bit of a caveat in that probably because the UK sector is the biggest. And we reckon we're among the biggest in the UK, that might be a reasonable guess to make. But we're much bigger than what you might consider to have been the kind of classical, and we'll come back to kind of changes in the size of the sector, but the classical kind of outfits when sort of GSB were dominating everything towards the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. The scale of the work out there has increased, so the scale of the businesses that are servicing the sector has increased kind of commensurately with that. So I'm not suggesting that, like, it's not a look at us, aren't we massive, it's brilliant, but if we're this big, if the sector is big enough to sustain a purely archaeological geophysics business of this scale, you know, we're all sort of operating in a world where the workload that's out there is much greater than it would have been sort of 25 years ago when I sort of first got into doing commercial archaeological work. Just to kind of put that into some numbers, probably the important ones to think about, we're regularly doing over 1,000 hectares of purely magnetic survey in a month, and that's not all of the work that we're doing. We have in-house capability to undertake all of the geophysical prospection techniques that you might expect. We've got UAV capabilities, etc. But particularly where we think we set ourselves separately is we're really, and always have been when Chris and Finn and Graham set the company up, been focused on research and development, new techniques, new technologies, pushing the envelope and trying to drive archaeological geophysics forward as much as just to do the work that's necessary. So we have staff in our organisation who are dedicated to our R&D. We produce and maintain our own equipment, which is bespoke to us. We use different sensors to what other people in the sector might use, and we'll come back to that later on. We develop our own software, we develop our own algorithms for processing the data, and we've got dedicated staff in the building who are working on implementation of things like AI in our processing and reporting processes. So the sector as a whole, as I say, changed dramatically, even over the last sort of 10 years probably. You know, I think back, and again, this is something I'll touch on later before I hand over to Finn. I think back, and when I started doing geophysics, 40 hectares was an awful lot of work. I remember thinking that we'd done very well to survey 200 hectares at Portus for a research project, and that was enormous. And around the same time, you know, there's sort of the big classic surveys in the UK, like the Roxeter survey, etc., and they were all in the tens of hectares, but not the hundreds, and certainly not the thousands. So whereas now it's feasible and probably we would say desirable to survey the entirety of a 2,000 hectare proposed solar farm or a cable route or a gas pipeline or whatever it is, that just wasn't conceivable sort of back in the day. But if that's what we're doing, and I think we should be, or we think we should be, then it requires investment, and it requires a process of working or a means of working which is fit for purpose with that. And a lot of that comes back to how we interact with other contractors, with consultants, with end clients, project management teams, etc. And I think that's where this comes in to today's AGM and this conversation. So there's three sort of broad themes I think we want to talk about. I'm going to talk a little bit about these to begin with. So first one, if we think about sort of project design, one of the things that we find, and again, what I'm trying to do is present sort of our experience of this from our angle, is in project design, we're sometimes not involved until quite late on. So if we hark back to the now outdated and hopefully at some point in the not too distant future soon to be replaced MCIfA standards and guidance for geophysical survey, they're saying briefs and things should be produced by people who know what they're doing, in essence. You know, and that should be written down somewhere. We often find that there is something that's written down, but it's not necessarily produced by people who are, are at the cutting edge of the field and are fully cognizant of what's possible and what is, if not normal, what can be done without any sort of particular stretch, if you like. So we would argue that really, again, based on our experience within the sector, that early advice is really crucial. We can help craft, we other geophysical specialists can help craft methodologies, written schemes of investigation, that sort of thing. We can provide the advice that will get you, your client, whoever, to the desired outcome the most efficient and most effective way. This can also help with ensuring that programs are met. It can ensure that costs are kept down. As I say, it can make sure that we're essentially tailoring the work that's being done to the results that are desired, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all approach and just saying we need a geophysical survey, so we're just going to do MAG because that's what everyone expects, even where it's not necessarily the most effective technique to use. Other little bits and pieces, we're often the first contractors on site, but certainly in any kind of length of time or substantial way. So that kind of integration into the overall thought about how the project's going to be managed and how the project's going to be moved forward, if we're in a position we're making that first contact, then that's kind of key to how you manage landowner, or how we all manage landowner relationships as we're going on. I realise I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit with some of this, but just in case there is anybody who's not quite up to speed with us and what we do, or even from the perspective of doing this from a purely geophysics contractor, because it is a little bit different, having had muddier boots in the past. So corridors and risk management, I think that's one of the things that we've been pushing for a while, and that's starting to get some traction, we feel, with consultants, clients, and so on and so forth. Traditionally, if you've got a corridor scheme, something will get designed, you'll end up with a narrow corridor. Some people will try and get away with 20 meters, it might be a 30-meter easement, 60 meters, 100 meters, doesn't really matter. The image on the left, sorry, I'm pointing at my other screen, which obviously is pointless, isn't it? The image on the left of what you're looking at was a narrow corridor. I can't remember exactly what the width of that is, but let's say 60 meters for argument's sake. It originally went through the middle of the expanded area of coverage. I'm not entirely sure how to get a pointer. Can you see my cursor as well, or is that not being shared? No, fine. Just imagine that there's a corridor running through the middle of that big area of geophysics. Essentially what happened is narrow corridor gets done, we hit some archaeological anomalies along the way, and so we then have to recost, go back and expand the survey to either side for them to think about redesigning in order to go around something that they don't want to have to deal with. The argument we would make is, actually, if you start off by doing a full search corridor, yes, it's more work up front, it's more expenditure up front, but you're de-risking the project because it enables design solutions to be employed in order to get around areas of significant archaeology that we might want to leave as they are. And the image on the right, essentially, if you can see it, this was an example of the sort of where that kind of thing happened. There's an initial search corridor where we're doing sort of whole fields rather than a narrow corridor. That found stuff, and then eventually there's a rerouting. We do the same thing there, and then the DCO gets designed through the middle of that area based on an avoidance strategy for any areas of particularly high archaeological potential, or areas that want to be avoided because it would be too costly to deal with it. Second point to make, I suppose, is sort of touching on that with other techniques that can be employed in terms of project design. We're not necessarily just thinking about magnetics. I would really like to stress that we're not just thinking about target acquisition, so it's not just about finding sites. There is a site here, there's some archaeological features in the bottom right hand corner of the bit that's labelled Area 1, and there's something sort of square in the middle of the other field. You can see that on the right hand image, which is the interpretation from an electromagnetic survey that was done at the same time, which we can carry out literally at the same time as the magnetic surveys. So there's a minimal impact there on the cost and time that's taken. And what we're looking at is that sort of correlation between where archaeological features may be present, whether we can see them or not in the magnetics, but also those kind of areas where activity might have happened in the past. So in areas where you don't get visible structures, let's say. If you're thinking about your sort of your must farms or flag fen, your fenland environments, that sort of thing, you've got a lot of wooden structures. You're not going to see those with magnetics, but you will be able to see, using some of the techniques, where the differences are, where the kind of liminal spaces are between the dry zones in antiquity and the wet patches. So what we're able hopefully then to give you is a sense of where there might have been people doing stuff, like maybe in the Mesolithic or the Neolithic or whatever, and that's kind of really valuable, because we fight a lot against that whole idea that, like, oh, it's East Anglia, geophysics doesn't work here, that type of thing. Yeah, maybe you don't see very much with a magnetic survey, but that's not, magnetics are not geophysics. There's other things that can be done, and there are other ways of helping to try and either de-risk a project, or at least establish what the possibilities are for the types of things that might have to be dealt with later on with intrusive mitigation strategies and that kind of thing. So I'm trying to keep it to time, so it's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind. Next thing that occurred to us was, once you've dealt with project design and thinking about what we can apply, things we can do, sorry, swig of tea, there's the logistics of actually getting the thing off the ground. And for anyone who was at the FAME forum and AGM last year, you might have heard Tarek from Towergate talking about contracts. One of the biggest difficulties that we face, I'm laughing about this because it's what I spend most of my time dealing with these days, are contracts. We all know that infrastructure projects have often particularly onerous contractual relationships. We're looking at this from being sort of very far down the food chain, if you like, and we're getting a lot of stuff that's being rolled onto us with back-to-back contracts, or there's head contracts behind any sub-consultancy that we might be asked to sign up to. So we're finding that actually a lot of the time and effort that goes into things is in assessing the risk that's involved in signing up to any, again, preaching to the choir, but assessing the risk that's involved in any particular contract, trying to understand how we fit into that, where we can sort of negotiate an appropriate level of risk for ourselves within a project which might carry a lot more risk overall, and where that can be sort of balanced. And sort of to come back to what I was saying before, is the earlier that we can be involved in, or contractors like us can be involved in that process, the more chance there is of us not getting into a snarl when we're actually trying to move the project forward. It's one thing to be appraised of a potentially difficult contractual situation at the point of tendering for something, and then have sort of plenty of time to kind of work out how that might function, to try and negotiate on any points of real contention. And an entirely different scenario if you landed with a contract, somebody's saying, yeah, here's 2,000 hectares worth of mag, off you go and do it. Oh, but by the way, you need to sign up to this contract, and we're not going to tell you about it until, or we haven't told you about it until now. So that's really kind of a little bit of a call to be, again, sort of early engagement for us is really crucial, because timeliness is such an important thing in getting a lot of these kind of early phase non-intrusive works done. Finn might have something to add later about that, but I'll let him do that in his allotted time. Land access is one of the other things. If we're talking about timeliness and getting things done at an appropriate moment, we, as I'm sure everyone does, has some varied experiences with some of the land access management teams that are out there. Probably only really want to make one point about this from again, very much from our perspective. There can be quite a lot of double, if not triple, handling involved in the way that some projects are set up in terms of the management structure, and I realise that that's not necessarily always going to be something that anybody in this room has control over. But it's particularly annoying when you get something where a land access team have said, well, you can't possibly do this unless you tell us what fields you want access to. You tell them what fields you want access to and when you want it, and then their response to that is, oh yeah, you need to call them before you go on it. And if we just miss out that middle step and actually kind of allow access arrangements maybe within some kind of defined structure, but if we're going to call people before we get on site anyway, is there really any point of somebody else sitting in a different office somewhere else calling them first to say, oh, somebody will call you just before they get there? It feels like one of the most clunky parts. And because we're moving from parcel to parcel in a very, very rapid fashion, taking away that ability to actually kind of proactively manage things in a way that works for us and also for the landowners. Obviously, we can't forget about the requirements or the constraints that we're working within in that respect, but in a way that's a direct conversation in that sense can create some unnecessary friction in terms of moving things forward, again, in a kind of timely and efficient manner. That's a sheep in PPE, which I think is brilliant presentation, to be perfectly honest with you. With the other, I suppose one of the other things along the same vein is the land access system is it's this kind of general thing of signing up to other people's requirements for things when they're not necessarily appropriate to the nature of the work that's being carried out. It would have been better if that sheep was wearing a fireproof boiler suit, but we are, as a lot of organisations are, there's too many zeros in that, I've just realised. ISO 45001, not 450,000, 45001 certified. So we have very robust health and safety systems in place, which are independently certified to what for most people is the sort of the highest certification standards out there, and at the same time we're asked to conform to, as I'm sure everyone is, to conform to other processes and other policies, sometimes without being told what those processes or policies are going to be, and therefore unable to reflect any additional burden on ourselves, our staff, our management systems, our IT infrastructure, or whatever else it might be, in the costing for the work or the expectation of how long it's going to take. One of the most egregious was being required to wear fireproof boiler suits in case an electricity substation exploded when we were 5¼ miles away from it in a field on the side of a hill in Wales. Not very likely to be electrocuted there, but nonetheless, like railways, you have to be in full orange. It's the same sort of thing, and obviously we're sort of frustrated by that, as I'm sure a lot of other people are. So I'll move rapidly on. Last one I think under this sort of heading is we've had some experience as well where not necessarily through, again, anyone who might be in this room, but a lot of end clients want to, as they see it, mitigate their risk by splitting contracts between multiple survey contractors. It actually creates a lot more, as I'm sure you're aware, can create a lot more headaches. You've got multiple different subcontractors to manage. There are differences in the data sets. There are differences in the way that people draw things. This slide is intended to illustrate that there are physical differences and technical differences between even magnetometers. Not all magnetometers are created equal. They don't measure in the same way. They don't necessarily measure to the same sensitivity. They don't actually necessarily measure the same they don't measure in the same way. There's different ways of measuring magnetism, and not all will give you exactly the same results under the same conditions. So that in itself can be problematic. If you get a data set from one contractor, it might not actually marry with a data set from a different contractor because the equipment that they're using is sort of fundamentally different, albeit it's still measuring magnetism. And then I just want to talk about capability briefly-ish. Because again, sort of we touched upon at the beginning, the capacity of the sector as a whole is much greater than it used to be. Mechanised systems like this are very, very common now. Wouldn't have been previously. Huge areas can be covered in a relatively short period of time, and I just kind of want to illustrate this difference in scale by using the Roxeter surveys, which were carried out in the late 90s. For those of you who know him, the bloke on the left in the grey jumper is Neil Linford from the Ancient Monuments Lab at Historic England, Fort Cumberland. That's their survey on the right hand side that was carried out in 97. About 80-ish hectares of magnetic radiometry. Huge survey at the time, massive undertaking, took months of work. for a number of different teams. If you can hear an alarm in the background, it's a fire alarm test. It's not real. We recently went back to do some work for the National Trust on the Attingham estate, which Roxeter lies next to. This was somewhere around 1,000 or 1,200 hectares of survey that we carried out over a few months, the back end of 2003, I think now. And Roxeter's just sort of in the centre of the image, but this is a big landscape survey surrounding that, and this is the kind of the difference in scale, very clearly evidenced. We know we can do a lot more. Historically, there's a tension, or there has been a tension between scale and resolution. So you could do landscapes, you could understand landscapes through surface collection, you could understand landscapes through aerial photography, but you couldn't really do high resolution geophysics across tens of square kilometres, or whatever else you might wish to do. We now, see from this, can cover tens of square kilometres relatively rapidly at very high resolution. I just wanted to illustrate the high resolution with the sort of the top part, the northern part of the city of the Roman city at Roxeter. The thick sort of grey-black line that's moving around it is the city wall. There's a load of detail of the insulae within the northern part of the city in this image. So we're picking up more detail with our survey, with our equipment that we're using a year and a half ago or whatever it was now, compared to what was being done in the 1990s. That's not that the fundamentals of the technique have changed, but also kind of illustrates that not every sensor is exactly the same. Quick interpretation plot of that, you can sort of maybe pick out from that a little bit more that we're getting quite fine-grained results within specific areas. I'm just using this as an example. There's loads of rural stuff out there as well that we found in the hinterland, which is really exciting. And what we managed to do by doing this and by taking that survey into the wider landscape is to actually understand, if you look at the blue bits as an indicator, that's where we think we've got continuation of the street grid of the city outside the walls. So I don't have time to go into it now. There was a longer presentation about this at a geophysics conference in December last year, but we're sort of rewriting the history of the site as was defined by those big surveys in the 90s. They thought the walls were at the maximum extent of wherever it had ever got to. We've got evidence that actually the planned city extended beyond that to the north at least. So it's worth redoing things. It's worth thinking about how long your data's valid for. It's also really, as I say, kind of that key thing that you don't have to compromise now really between scale and resolution of data. You can get both, and you should. Anyway, that's my slightly polemic, a little bit ranty talk over, and I'll hand over to Finn for the exciting bit about what we might want to do in the future or not.
I feel like I said earlier that Paul was going to leave me about 30 seconds to run through 5 slides, which I think is what he's done. Can you hear next? I realise I also don't have a pointer, so I'm not in control of my presentation. There we are. So no talk about geophysics in 2025 will be complete without talking about drones. Hit next. So we started experimenting with drones in architectural geophysics back in 2021, 2022. And we invested a hideous sum of money, about £30,000, into a system which we thought was going to be, a way forward, something really exciting. And it kind of works. This data is kind of comparable to the magnetic data collection systems we were using back in 2010, maybe a bit earlier. So it's comparable to an old gridded survey. It's not terrible, but it does kind of work. But there are issues. If you hit next, Paul. As you can imagine, this is a big thing to talk about, and so there were a lot of talks about this at the most recent conference on archival prospection, which was in Ghent about a month ago. There's a lot of people presenting on using drones, some slightly better than the ones that we have tried and tested in-house, but they all end up running into the same issues, which is that physics is a problem. Drones are really magnetic, and they use electric motors, which are also really magnetic. So they interfere with the systems. They create quite a lot of noise. And on the next slide, magnetic sensors also need to be really close to the ground to work, or really close to the features to work. So this data from a test, again, presented at the ICAP conference. When you're flying the mag sensors at ground level, 25 centimeters above the ground, yeah, it's great, brilliant. Find some really nice features, detects everything that you would expect to be detected. By the time you lift that up to being about a meter, you're losing quite a bit, but it still kind of works. As soon as you get any higher than that, you might as well not bother doing the survey. You're just not detecting anything that's useful. You're not able to use that information to position any future stuff. So where should we be using drones? Next slide, please. When we first started testing this, I thought the drones would be a fantastic thing to try on sites that we can't physically get on because of crop. But when we actually tried doing that, we realized that at the point that we can't get on to survey, the crop is normally 60, 70 centimeters above the ground. You've got to fly the drone 50 centimeters above that, because otherwise it crashes into the crop, which then means you've got the drone and the mag sensor about a meter up, which then means you're getting into that position where, is it really getting you the kind of information that you want? So that was a bit disappointing. Next slide, please. So I'm back to thinking that the place we should actually be using drones is kind of where they were designed for. So Sensys, who make most of the mag sensors that go on drones, they make them for finding ordnance, because it's a really, flying a drone to find ordnance in a place where otherwise you have to wear a full EOD suit. That's a really good use of a drone. And also places where you physically can't go. So intertidal zones, bits that are just too wet. You know, that's a great place. It's going to work really well there. Places where you physically can't get ground sensors in. Next slide, please. And I'm not saying that this is going to be the case forever. There's quite a lot of work by the Civil Aviation Authority on when drones can and can't be used, which is very much ongoing. Currently, drones essentially have to be flown within visual line of sight of the pilot, which means you have to have eyes on that drone at all times to meet any commercial license. There is one agricultural company who has a license to fly a drone beyond visual line of sight for crop spraying, but as far as I'm aware, no one else in this kind of sector. So you have to have eyes on all the time, which means you can't let the drone get very far away from you, which means you can't survey very big areas. But that is changing. So this is the CAA's roadmap for BVLOS, beyond visual line of sight operational scenarios. By the time we get out to kind of 2027, 2028, the restrictions on flying BVLOS might start to ease. So there might be more companies who are able to fly drones beyond visual line of sight, which does open up other areas. It doesn't make it possible to survey larger areas. But at the moment, I don't think it's that it's impossible, but it's that it's too expensive and too much of a paperwork headache for anyone really to do legally or insurably. So that's my little bit on drones. And then the other thing that I think could be interesting over the next few years is AI. So people tend to think of AI as being either image generation, making funny videos, or something like ChatGPT, where you're asking a computer to help you write your coursework or similar. So we've had a bit of proper R&D work on both of these things. So next slide, please. We employ someone who spends 90% of his time working on using AI to aid geophysical interpretation. So we're in a very fortunate position of having, we go back to Paul's comment of this, if we're the largest architectural geophysics firm in the world, then we probably also have one of the largest data sets, training data sets that we can use to train AI on. So we've trained an AI model on about half of the data that we've collected. So I think that's something around 25,000 hectares of magnetometer data and interpretation to try see if that can aid us, see if that can speed up our interpretation. It's not going to replace humans entirely, but there are less archaeological geophysicists out there and more people wanting to do archaeological geophysics. So we need to aid that interpretation with some pretty promising results. Data set on the left, standard magnetometer data set with areas of natural, areas of archaeological activity, and then sort of really modern stuff like pipes and drainage. We haven't trained it on pipes and drainage yet, hence why they're not picked out. But on the right, you can see what the AI thinks we found. And it's done a pretty good job of picking out the archaeology and areas of natural that might be of interest. Next slide. And then if we think about using a ChatGPT-like model to help, we've also, again, trained an internal model, so a private model, one that doesn't exist outside of our offices, so it's not sharing data with OpenAI or Google or anything like that. We've taken about 12,000 reports from the ADS that mention geophysics, and we've fed that into an internal model. And so we now have an internal chatbot, which can go, we can ask it questions, it can go find reports, it can go find information from that ADS library, that internal ADS library, and give us some information back. It's not perfect, it needs a huge amount of additional work, but it allows us to find things which we would not be able to find using the current sources available. I know the ADS have just improved their map search, but it's still pretty clunky. So it's that kind of thing. So those are just the two things that I think are aspects that might help to improve archaeological geophysics as we go forward. I'm sure there are lots of others that people might have ideas about, but I think we're probably already over our time. So I will leave it there.